Welcome to Edvance, the brand new podcast for driving high performance in education. I'm Vikas Poddar, the founder and CEO of T4 Education and executive chair of the Education Leaders Forum. Every fortnight, I'll be speaking to the world's leading lights and high achievers in education whose stories deserve to be told. Tune in to hear them reveal the greatest lessons they've learned in their lives to find out what high performance means to them. If you too are interested in how we get high performance in education, hit our subscribe button on any platform where you get your podcasts so we can build our community together. In today's Edvance Podcast, I'm speaking to Nick Grono, who is an Australian human rights campaigner and is currently the CEO of the Freedom Fund, which focuses on the scourge of human trafficking. Nick has been an advocate, a leader in the sector for over 2 decades, has run many organizations, serves on many nonprofit boards, and has also worked in politics and in the public sphere in Australia for quite some time. You know, I'm pleased that he's able to join us here today because he's recently written a book titled, How to Lead Nonprofits, turning purpose into impact to change the world. And whilst our podcast isn't focused on the nonprofit sector, I certainly think there's a lot we can learn from other parts of the world of work, including the nonprofit sector, which is quite powerful and important to society, just as much as education is. I welcome Nick to this interview. Nick, welcome to the Edvance Podcast. And what I've been super curious about are, firstly, just your career. You've had an incredible career in the not-for-profit space. You've built the Freedom Fund, which really does tackle one of the biggest scourges that I can think of, which is human trafficking. And you build it from being nothing from an idea to something pretty significant. And in that process, as well as advising other nonprofits and being very active in the space for nearly 2 decades, you've obviously picked up a lot of learnings. Like, I'm sure a lot of wins as well as not so great results, like we all do to some degree. But I want to specifically touch on the book that you've written, which talks about, how to lead nonprofits, turning purpose into impact to change the world for the better. And when you think of it from that basis, we in education and in schools, exactly the same thing. We do, educators, if you ask any school principal, they don't do it for the money because there is no money. They do it with that very wholehearted, nation building purpose that I think a lot of people can speak to. And so in there lies a certain amount of alignment of purpose. And I wanted to understand from you, from your not-for-profit, experience, what are the big things that people should look out for when it comes to leading such organizations? And please speak about the nonprofit side of it, because I think our viewership and listenership will be interested in hearing about other sectors and how they're built. And then I'll ask you relevant questions regarding, education and if there are any parallels. So please, over to you. Tell us about your book.
Well, thanks, Vikas. And look, I've written a book about nonprofit leadership in part because there is very little written practical practitioner focus that's been written about nonprofit leadership. Lots written about business leadership. Hundreds of books come out every month on business leadership. And obviously there are aspects about leadership that is common, whether it's business, education, nonprofit, right? You are trying to get an organization to achieve certain outcomes and bring a team along with you. But there are very significant differences between business leadership and nonprofit leadership. And I think a lot of those differences will be relevant to educational leadership as well, right? And the core difference is around purpose. Right? Purpose of a business is to achieve a financial return. They might have a secondary purpose, but basically you're being judged, particularly for public companies, on your financial returns. Whereas the purpose of a nonprofit is to achieve positive change. It might be at the community level, it might be at the city level, the state level, or globally. And of course, purpose of an education leader is to achieve positive change. You are educating the people that you are working with. I can't think of a more important purpose. It just is absolutely key. And that has challenges and opportunities. Let me start with the opportunity. First, the opportunity, and this is where education leaders, nonprofit leaders have a huge advantage over their kind of for-profit counterparts. Purpose is really powerful. there's a lot of research about the power of intrinsic motivation, the desire to do something because it's good in of itself, as opposed to extrinsic motivation, which might be pay and salary and benefits. And there's a lot of surveys saying, that organizations that have a powerful intrinsic motivation often perform better than those that are relying on salary and benefits to drive performance. And the idea of leaning into purpose, in my case, tackling the scourge of modern slavery and human trafficking around the world, or educating our youth, right? It's really powerful if it's used effectively. Now, the challenges come the other way, right? First of all, because often it's not clear the impact that you are trying to achieve, or it's not clear how you measure the impact you are trying to achieve. Again, with a business, you can measure financial performance. I can compare the performance of Google versus Amazon versus Walmart versus whatever, right, on their financial metrics. How do I compare the performance of my organization, the Freedom Fund, against another anti-slavery organization, let alone an organization that is working on education or is working on health or nutrition, right? There are real challenges. And that's important because often there are real challenges around accountability. If you can't measure performance, you can't measure accountability in the same way. And then the final difference that I'll touch on between particularly businesses on the one hand and nonprofits and education institutions, I think, is around the multiplicity of stakeholders. Right? If you're a business, and again, a public business in particular, you have one key stakeholder, your shareholders. You have to pay attention to others, but in the end, right, your shareholders are keeping a close eye on the performance of the organization and will express their views accordingly. With a nonprofit, we have multiple stakeholders to whom we have to pay attention. The communities we serve, our funders, our staff, who can be very vocal about these issues, right? The peer organizations that we work with, our board. And again, in an educational context, you have your students, but you also have your institution, you have your parents, you have, the local authorities that you are responsible to. And that can be really challenging for leaders in this space because you are juggling multiple stakeholders, and what appeals to one stakeholder might absolutely not appeal to another stakeholder. So there's lots there. I'll stop there and we can explore more of that if you find that of interest.
And I think about businesses in particular, which I'm very familiar with, who try to put purpose at the core of what they do. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with what you say about the shareholder being the only stakeholder that they're concerned about. And given the nature of how businesses are evolving, how the environment is being shaped, if you take ESG and you take all these different other avenues or areas that companies are now actively looking at. But I take your point about putting purpose at the core of what you do. And what nonprofits have in their abundance, obviously, it's written on the tin, as it were, is the purpose by which they've been set up and what they're trying to achieve. The question I really have around that is, I understand the role of intrinsic motivation, but do we not then start thinking in isolation or in silo when we think that is the only way that we can change the world?
Yeah, look, I'm talking in generalizations, right? And there's a lot more nuance. I agree. When it comes to business, there are businesses that are B Corps that put purpose at the center of their work, but they're a small fraction of the overall context. Businesses have to pay a lot more attention, but we're also seeing a pushback on ESG, the environmental, social, and governance factors and all the rest of it. And likewise, intrinsic motivation is not enough. I mean, one of my pet kind of peeves around the nonprofit space, particularly in the UK, is that we think it's appropriate to pay staff appallingly because they are working in the charity sector. Well, I look at it very differently. If you are leading an organization like Save the Children or Oxfam that has income of hundreds of millions of dollars and has thousands of staff, should we not be kind of treating the pay and benefits that reflect the nature of that organization versus a commercial organization that may have hundreds of millions? I think there is a misalignment so I don't want to say, people should just work for the love of it. What I am saying that all else being equal, intrinsic motivation is really powerful. People, and there are surveys of businesses where staff are asked, does it matter to you to have a purpose that you can relate to? And it's a hugely influential factor. So talking in general terms, but absolutely, I think these are really important factors.
And so then you go on to speak about people in particular in your book. So you talk about purpose, impact to start with, and you talk about all the quagmire of everything related to people. Do you want to say more about that and what you think are the things that we need to unlock in the education sector or even in the nonprofit sector are that leads to higher performance?
I structure my book around purpose. That's the kind of direction of travel. People, by which I mean your team, your CEO, your board, internal, and partners, your kind of external stakeholders. And people is key. I think that if you don't have a high-performing team, you are not going to be nearly as effective as you should be or could be. But there are challenges. And here I have to admit I don't have a detailed knowledge of the education sector versus the nonprofit sector, but in the nonprofit sector, my focus and my objective is to have a high-performing team. And I talk a lot about the importance of culture. I talk a lot about psychological safety, the willingness of people being able to speak up, to be heard without fearing that if they express a view, they'll be shot down, leading to a more effective team. And I think that broadly would apply in the education sector, except that I suspect there are often a lot more constraints at play that impact on some of these dynamics. I think the ideal in any nonprofit education is an environment where there is an ability to build powerful and effective teams that are all aligned around the objective you're trying to achieve, where people feel that they can air dissenting views and be heard. To my mind, I am a much better leader by having a team around me that is willing to challenge my decisions, voice other opinions, and I can draw on the wisdom of all of that, and then we can make the best possible decisions. That, I think, would be the ideal in the education context, but always there are external factors that may impede on that being the most effective way forward.
And, from leading a nonprofit and serving on so many boards, what have you learned about managing people?
Oh, it is the hardest thing of all. It just is. And whenever you bring together other nonprofit leaders, and I'm sure education leaders, it's like all the stresses come often from teams. And for me, it's both internally, it's also my board. Right? There can be real challenges at the board. I've got an amazing board, but we've had some really tough decisions and discussions. I talk in my book about, you said talk about successes. I talk a lot about failures. I talk about my failures because I can talk best about my failures. And I give an example of after the global financial crisis, 2007, 2008, my organization at the time, the International Crisis Group, which was a global conflict prevention organization, we had to cut our budget by about 10%. And I was the number two. I was the COO, the deputy president. And the CEO basically said, right, you go off and work out how we can do this most effectively. Well, what I should have done is sat down with, all of the divisions in my organization, worked out, consulted, got inputs, and then come back. What I did is, in fact, I decided where I thought we could most effectively make cuts. And then we came together for a senior staff retreat where basically teams were told where cuts were going to be made. And not surprisingly, they thought this was pretty outrageous. They also thought that it just wasn't really effective. And there was a staff rebellion, and they basically took over the senior staff retreat. I was hugely embarrassed about this. I had failed in managing the process. But what was really interesting was that they all agreed on the necessity of making cuts. So everyone came together and worked collectively to work out where we can most effectively make the cuts. They weren't in all the areas that I wanted to make the cuts, but I had surrendered my authority to do that. We ended up cutting by about 14%, right? So made more savings than we had planned on. And 2 years later, we had more than made up that income that we cut because everyone had been involved. There was a collective buying into the decision that might not have otherwise been there. So, I learned through that process. And the bottom line is you just have to spend the time and have the wisdom to invest in your team in a way that produces the best outcomes.
I'm pleasantly surprised that they didn't decide to cut the COO.
Well, I'm sure that it would have been on the table. But it's actually quite interesting, though, because even 2 or 3 years later, there was a belief that process in the end was handled very well. And I got undue credit for it, whereas I just saw it as being humiliating. So, there was more wisdom in the crowd than there was in the CEO, the COO.
And tell us a little bit about culture. I mean, it's a subject that you spoke about today in this call, but also I've heard you mention quite a bit in the past, and it's in your book. The reason I say so is because what we've been focusing on is very much organizational culture or school culture, which is referred to as the hidden curriculum in schools. Okay. These are the non-obvious things. But we have a fundamental belief that these are the things that lead to high performance. And so do you want to talk about how you build culture, how you see culture, how you assess culture, all those kinds of things?
Yeah, I think culture is key. But it's one thing to say that, and it's another thing to kind of make that real. And I think most CEOs will say culture is key, right? No, we'll invest in our culture and we have it. Well, the reality is a lot of organizations have bad cultures. And I think the key to culture is understanding that it's not enough to say you want culture. It's not enough to say, here are our values. I think you have to invest all the time in culture. I talk about culture in my organization ad nauseum, right? I'm sure staff get sick of me, but I want them to be reflecting themselves on what is the culture that we have and that we want at the organization. A CEO can't create a culture on their own. You can kind of dictate what you think should be happening, but if staff don't buy in, then the culture isn't there. And I'm sure there are a lot of organizations where the CEO will say, we have a great culture. And in fact, when you dig under the surface, they don't have a great culture, right? So I think the key to building an effective culture is, one, having a belief in the importance of it. Two, understanding that culture comprises norms and values, right? And the values are the things you say that matter, and the norms are the behaviors that reflect the kind of unwritten rules of the organization. I think the CEO has a really important role in modeling behavior that they say is important, right? If a CEO says that humility is really important and they display no humility, chances are the organization is not going to have a culture that reflects this. If the CEO states that there are values that they think are important, but again, it's not reflected. Psychological safety is key. Again, this idea that you give space to people to offer up their thoughts and views. I'll give you one example. I want a culture at the Freedom Fund where people feel free to question and raise questions and challenge so that we can have a rich discussion. And it's hard to do this as a CEO because you can say, let's do a phone call and anyone can ask me questions and no one wants to go on a record. So what I do is every 3 months we have a quarterly call. A different volunteer from the organization gets to interview me and they get to solicit questions anonymously from across the organization. So the questions aren't coming from the interviewer, they are coming from staff, but they are non-identified. And we have had such rich discussions. And they're often challenging discussions, Let's talk about your pay and benefits. Let's talk about X, Y, and Z. Let's talk about these decisions. But what it means is people are seeing that the CEO is willing to be questioned in an uncomfortable way and is willing to answer. And it's always very interesting to see the response to that process.
There's a great phrase that I heard, and it's a mantra almost in leadership, which is if you can't measure it, you can't address it, right? And so what tools did you use to measure culture in your organization?
So the primary tool we use is an anonymous survey of all staff every year, which we've done from the very first year when I was running the organization, when we were 6 staff, and we're now 80 staff. And it is anonymous. And not only do we solicit that, we feed all of the responses back. So it comes in, there's a questionnaire with about 20 or 30. We do 2 surveys, in fact. One is about how is the organization going, and the other is about my leadership. So people have the opportunity to comment on both. They also have the comment, they don't only have to answer kind of questions rated 1 to 5. There are free-form comments. And then we provide all of that feedback, collate it, feed it back to the staff and the board with my responses. So that's a key measure. That's one measure. That's probably the closest we get to measuring because we can then say, satisfaction of this organization out of 5 is 4.85, or the net promoter score, the question about would you recommend this organization to others. The other mechanisms that aren't as rigorous would be the staff calls that we do. I think those would be the main, and then the kind of individual performance reviews and so on. And if there are better ways, then always open to exploring them. But it's not easy putting yourself out there on the line every year, and I follow those survey results very, very closely. And it's a way of holding me accountable.
In T4, given the challenge that we see in high performance, we've actually created a tool, an assessment tool for schools to assess culture. And we measure it. It's thundering outside, actually, Nick. I know you're in. The rain does not make for good Wi-Fi either. So let's see what happens. But we've got this tool that we've created, the survey, the assessment we've created, what focuses on 4 big areas that all the research and evidence says that drive school culture, and it's called Best School to Work. It's a fascinating program that we have because you're right to say that it takes a certain kind of maturity, actually, to think about taking it, because it is a scorecard on leadership. And so congratulations to you in that regard.
It's also critically important, right? Because if you take that feedback, you have an opportunity to improve. You don't have to agree with it all, but it does cause me to reflect. And I'm fortunate to have that. I have to get over my ego, but when I do, it's helpful.
Fantastic. And the last component of your book talks about external partners. And again, if I think in terms of an education context, but there are tons of those. And so it's not just the learner or the student in the classroom, it's the community, it's the parents, it's teachers, it's the regulator, it's whoever, local businesses. And so what is the secret sauce?
There is no magic. I mean, I think the importance is understanding who are your stakeholders, right? Because often organizations don't understand all their stakeholders, right? They may just think that the students are the key stakeholders, or the parents. They may not even think of the students as their key stakeholders. They may think of the parents or of the institution itself, right? So first, a willingness to understand who are your stakeholders. I believe very powerfully in the power of relationship, right? And that means investing in those relationships. I think that that's a superpower for a leader, and you have to spend a lot of time building those relationships, and there is no substitute for that. And particularly when things get tough, then the fact that you have a relationship helps. Right. And so I talk a lot about investing in the communities that we serve, funders, peer organizations, and trying to build relationships, because it just is a huge benefit if you can do that.
How if you were to deconstruct your day, or do a time allocation, how much of your time is internal people management versus external stakeholder management?
I regularly say that at least 60% of my time is fundraising and external engagement. Right. Because in the end, to me, we as an organization, the Freedom Fund working on slavery, fund 180 other grassroots local organizations. So, and to me, there is little separation between external engagement and fundraising, right? Raising the profile of the organization, talking about the work is part of parcel of raising the fund. So, CEOs often are surprised to hear this. A lot of CEOs would like to think, well, I only have to spend 10, 20% on doing fundraising and engagement. Well, they're very fortunate if that's the case. But, the reason that the Freedom Fund has been successful is that we are willing to invest that time. And then after that, it would be investing in culture and leadership internally is a key component. That's the balance of the time.
Thanks. That makes a lot of sense. There's a couple of other areas that I've been quite curious about that came to my mind whilst we're speaking, that there's knotty problems in education that I'm sure are wider than just our sector. So, for example, when I look at, you must have heard about the famous recruitment and retention crisis of teachers the world over. And so we find it very difficult to recruit them. When we do, we can't keep them. There's a humongous amount of dissatisfaction with the external environment. I mean, in that situation, are there parallels with the nonprofit sector? And also low wages, actually, if you think on that basis, which we've already touched upon. What is your advice for education leaders, in particular school leaders, as to how they tackle the recruitment and retention crisis of their stars?
I think it's tremendously challenging. I talked about the power of intrinsic motivation, and that's so, but, teachers are appallingly paid. And again, I'm talking from the context of the UK and Australia, right? I hear that there is much more investment in teachers in Scandinavian countries, and, it reflects to me the values of society. I am stunned. And that's one area where the education sector has it even tougher than the broad nonprofit sector. People are badly paid off in a nonprofit sector. That's because nonprofits struggle to raise the funding. It's not because there are external constraints. And with teachers, I suspect in the most part, the constraints are often imposed by the state. So you don't have the same flexibility. At the Freedom Fund, we aim to pay staff at like the 75th percentile of the sector, right? So that we can attract and retain staff. And even though those percentiles are too low, it means that we are relatively more attractive than many of our peers, while also having low turnover. But I think and all you can do in that, given those constraints, is invest in culture and find other ways to make the experience as rewarding as possible. And that's easier said than done, I know, but that's what I would be doing in the space. It's like, I have this hard constraint on salaries, and recruitment then is going to require an investment in culture, and other factors that will make this as a rewarding experience as possible. Understanding that is challenging.
As you may recollect, I ran a philanthropic foundation for quite some time. And what really struck me about nonprofit leadership in particular and nonprofit organizations, which again, in the education sector, in schools in particular, we have a very similar issue, which is on burnout and motivation. And what has been your experience of, well, if I was a young CEO of a nonprofit or a school principal, and I had prolific, burnout in my senior leadership team or in my staff, how do you tackle that?
It's a big issue, and in fact, probably the biggest issue is CEO burnout. I wrote a little. So one of my chapters is about the CEO, and I wrote a little bit in the chapter. Much of it was about priorities for CEO, and at the end, I wrote about loneliness, and I wrote about kind of looking after the CEO and burnout. Making a point that, if you work yourself to the point of exhaustion, you are doing no one any favors. You are not leading your organization as well as you could. You are not serving yourself. But it's really challenging. I'm working on modern slavery and human trafficking. We always want to do more. It is the most horrendous of issues. And the belief that you can do more by working harder is very powerful and if not kept in check, destructive. And I'm sure it's the same with teachers, right? We have insufficient resources. We aren't given the support we need. I just have to work harder. But that way lies a destructive path. But it's very easy to say that, and it's very hard to address it. I do think there needs to be a lot more investment in welfare of staff and welfare of the CEO, the leaders. And the starting point is for a recognition that you do no one any favors if you are utterly exhausted and burnt out. But again, it's one of those things that is easier to say than to kind of make real.
And so if you just take the Freedom Fund as an example, what good practices do you have on burnout, not just CEO burnout, but general burnout of your staff?
We are going through a strategic planning process right now where one of the key concerns of Express for staff is workloads. But it's a mixed blessing because we are going to simplify the structure and reduce the offerings and make them more concentrated so that there is less demands on staff. And a lot of staff don't like that because, in fact, while they complain about burnout, they always want to do more. So it's almost a paternalistic approach of like, well, we will give you less so that you do less so that there is less burnout. And I think it's being very real about the demands. I think it's also talking about it. Right. And again, it comes back to culture and saying, these are our expectations. The environment in my organization, very high performing organization, but there is no expectation for people to be working before 9 a.m. or after 5:30. That is hugely different from the organization I was working at 10 or 15 years ago, where I was in most weekends. I was working for a boss who was in every weekend, all weekend. And the belief was to be effective, you just had to work super long hours all the time. Well, one, the evidence is there that in fact, you can only perform effectively for a certain number of hours a day. So, and the other is, I think the culture is moving in a better direction generally, not uniformly, but better where, the discussion about being able to switch off and so on, if managed sensibly, I think makes a lot of sense.
What do you do about that pessimism that comes from wider society about what you do? So, in your case, human trafficking, obviously, it's a big, important subject. But frankly, we have such a problem, and you can almost surmise no one really cares. In a similar way, I could say education, no one really cares. And so as a CEO, as a leader, how do you tackle that?
I am kind of implicitly optimistic, which may be why I'm still in the business, because it is a tough business. I think, have to be optimistic. But where I get real strength from, and I'm sure this is relevant to the education sector as well, is when I engage with the communities we serve, I know we are making a difference to those communities. We may not be making a global difference all the time, but we invest and work with partners in places that have very high levels of kids who have been trafficked into sexual exploitation or forced to work in factories. And when I can go there and see the difference that working with our partners we can make to a community, that is the hugest reward. And I have to think that working as in the education sector, working as a teacher, you have to get to the students and, despite the complexities and the mess often that the system might be in, the reward that you get from students who benefit from your engagement must be the biggest. I mean, there's a very big reason why people talk about the importance of teachers in their lives.
Nick, I would be remiss in today's age of podcasts and ever such media to not ask you about technological advancements and what they mean for the leader in particular, given the pace of change that is happening in our societies and in our workplaces, in our organizations. And so what is your advice for leaders who, all around us? I can't go a day without hearing about ChatGPT or generative AI, and so how does one get their head around this in particular? Because if the goal is to serve society, and people are saying that these things are as important as foundational literacy and numeracy, how does one think about technology and disruption?
Look, I think they're a mixed blessing. I mean, I started my career off as a lawyer, and I'm old enough now to remember days before email and days of faxes. And I remember someone who was older than me talking about the day they used to write letters from Australia and ship them off to the UK, take 3 weeks to get a response, and things moved at that pace. Whereas now, and when I left my legal career, email was just becoming prevalent. And that means that you're on 24/7, right? And then when you take away email and you've got WhatsApp and Signal and everything. So at some level, it has accelerated the demands and the pace. And I think that's really, really tough. On the other hand, of course, they can be a magnificent productivity tool. And I'm increasingly using ChatGPT as a shortcut to summarize things or to draw out information. I mean, my greatest use of ChatGPT, because I have multiple calls in multiple jurisdictions all the time, is just to say, hey, ChatGPT, 3 p.m. in India on the 3rd of July is going to be what time here in the UK? I mean, I know there are apps to do it, but it just actually is easier to ask ChatGPT, right? And so I think that if they are harnessed correctly, then they can be a huge productivity boost. The trouble is, all of these things increase the pressure for you to do more too. So it's matching the boosts with the managing of expectations, which we aren't very good at doing. And I worry that we'll just get into an ever more demanding cycle of productivity demands.
Nick, I can't let you leave this podcast without speaking about human trafficking and what educators and schools and institutions can do to help you. Do you want to share some words on that?
Yeah. So look, human trafficking, modern slavery affects some 50 million people around the world. And whenever we hear about it, we often think that it's in poor countries, right? But in fact, it's in every country around the world. It's here in the UK where I am. It's here in Australia, which is where I was born and grew up, right? It exists in situations. And often people think it's things like what they've seen in movies like Taken, and it's just women and girls who are kidnapped and forced into sex work. But it's much more prevalent than that. It's migrants who come to these countries and they don't have a work visa, so they can be exploited because, their employer will say, well, if you want to get paid, or if you don't want to work obscene hours, I will report you to the authorities. It's a level of exploitation, and it's prevalent in the UK, it's prevalent in agriculture, it's prevalent in the building industry, it's prevalent in people working in private homes. You often get reports of domestic staff who have been brought from overseas by diplomat or others who are locked up and forced to work. So I think it's really important. And also, and particularly with children, where we get a lot of engagement is around things like fast fashion, right? Or in producing the phones or the minerals that power our phones that rely on exploitation in places like the Congo. So it touches all of us in multiple ways. In anything we do, there is the risk and potential of trafficking. So I think it's something that kids often are particularly engaged with, as they become more socially conscious about the environment. They also become more socially conscious about where our things are coming from and where they're made. And so for educators, I think it's something worth leaning into. There is a lot of engagement. If you want to engage your kids in powerful social issues, talk to them about where do clothes that are produced by Shein or other fast fashion, where are they sourced from? What are the claims that have been made about the materials and the sourcing of the materials? How do you produce an item of clothing for $1 or $2? A t-shirt or a pair of jeans for £5 without there being exploitation in the supply chain. And if we think that matters, what can we do about it? And there are lots of resources out there. There are some great resources for educators. And so, and if they're really interested, they can reach out to us and we'll direct them to places that can give them lots of information.
And by giving some data points.
So 50 million people in modern slavery today, that's more than the population of Australia or the population of Canada. Estimated $250 billion a year in illicit profits from modern slavery. It's up there with arms trafficking and illegal drug production as the most explicit. Overwhelmingly or disproportionately affects women and girls, right? So significant majority of those in modern trafficking are women and girls, forced to work unconscionable hours for little or no pay under the threat of violence. People often think, slavery ended with a couple of hundred years ago. But just what happened is that it changed its name and it changed its form, and it's a hidden crime. And so it's so prevalent. In the UK, estimated over 100,000 people in slavery today in this country. In America, hundreds of thousands. So I think it's really important not to think that it's a faraway problem. It's a problem both in our countries or that touches us in multiple ways.
Well, Nick Grono, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Vikas, thank you for having me on. It was a great discussion.
So we just concluded this very, revealing and interesting podcast interview with Nick Grono of the Freedom Fund. And I'm struck with the three things that we take away from our conversation with him, which are also mirrored in his book somewhat. So the first lesson he talks about when it comes to high performance is to focus on purpose. He talked about it being a powerful motivation for nonprofits and educational institutions, which is very true. I mean, how many school principals, leaders, or teachers do I know who do it for the money? Not many. And so they focus on the good that they're bringing into this world by making sure that every single young person can achieve their potential. So the focus on purpose is an important thing that we need to think about when it comes to organizational effectiveness. The second is to lean into culture. Now, this, for example, has been one of the things that we've been focused on for quite some time by creating Best School to Work as an example, which is a tool for schools to actually firstly assess their school culture and then figure out how we can go about improving it. You need to build effective teams. You need to provide psychological safety. You need to make sure that you look after our staff in terms of burnout. We need to make sure all of these issues are taken care of. And so his advice was to lean into culture. And the third, in terms of leadership styles in particular, what he talked about was, well, you need to bring a coaching approach to one's leadership, support others to succeed. And yes, that's very easy to do. But, through his work, he was explaining that actually how transparency and accountability are quite important in that process. And I suppose the final thing that Nick talked about was one part of it was lean into culture when it comes to your internal stakeholders, but also then think about, your external stakeholders, your community, your parents, the businesses in your neighborhood, your regulators, your so and so forth. And he talked about from a nonprofit basis that he spent 60% of his time doing that because as a nonprofit, he also has to raise money. But there's something to be said about stakeholder management that leads to high performance. And through the World's Best School Prizes, we look at the community collaboration piece that stems out of the work of Brookings Institute on community schools and how it's such a massive enabler for high performance. And so those are the main points that I think Nick raised through our interview. And I'm really grateful to him for taking the time out. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please do hit the subscribe button on whichever platform you use to listen to podcasts. Your listenership and your followership will just help us get better guests as time goes on. Thank you for your support. I look forward to the next interview.